Good evening, Meridian single adults. Jeff and I are so happy to be with you. We have prepared messages to inspire hope and healing with a desire to increase your capacity to create a bright future and a happy life. We will each spend a little time focusing on our 3 Ps: peace, progress, and pairing up. We hope you will leave motivated to intentionally work on personal development and prepare for your future companion. Our first focus is about each singles adult's journey toward peace. I'd like each of you to close your eyes and take a deep breath. Find where you feel peace in your body. Take another deep breath and search your mind for any disharmony, sadness, or frustration that may be in the way of you feeling as much peace as you otherwise could. Take one more deep breath and open your eyes. Welcome back. As life and relationship coaches, we developed a thought work model for mid-singles. Essentially, to implement this tool, we get really aware of the stories we tell about the facts of our lives, and we accept that we have a choice. We can keep those stories, or we can also shift them to stories and thoughts that better serve us and elevate the energy and emotions we carry to naturally improve our own behaviors and ultimately create the outcomes we want in our lives. The acronym for this process is FSEEBO, F-S-E-E-B-O. And you can find more about this particular model on our YouTube channel and our podcast episode featuring the FSEEBO model. Shifting our stories to better service is one of the most effective ways to create more peace in our mind, body, and spirit. Let me give you an example of a story that did not serve me well when I was a single adult. As we were going through the divorce process, my first husband kept telling me that I would never find anyone as good as him. There was a part of me that must have adopted that notion, and it kept me stuck. I accepted the first man who came along as my only alternative, and I ended up in a brief second marriage that did not work. After that ended, I got really intentional about finding the very best person for me, which meant believing in something new, something that may have even felt a little impossible at the time. I made every effort to believe that I could find in a sea of men who weren't best for me, that one special someone who was, and I did. After that, or as I was dating intentionally, and I continued not getting the results I wanted, it could get discouraging. Did that make my first husband right? Did that really mean I could never find anyone as good as him for me? There are a lot of stories, much like this one, I had to shift along the way. There are some thoughts I practiced, like, I am worthy of someone who really loves me, and I am happy being single as long as it takes to discover him. Now, let me give you an example of a story that did serve me well. One of my dating partners once told me that plants are amazing because they know how to take poison and turn it into love and life. This little new story, this little thought sparked a new direction for me. If nature does it, perhaps I could do the same when frustrating situations presented themselves. Ironically, I chose to end all other dating relationships, which I rarely did, to exclusively date the same guy, who ended up wanting out of that relationship within a week. I was tempted to and I felt myself going into this constant rumination for days. Have you ever done that? Where, for days you think about how unfair it was and you go through all the details surrounding it. I mean, I needed to make stories to fill in all the missing pieces. I stopped myself and I went out to the maple tree in my yard, which turned red each fall, and it was in the middle of that process. I picked a leaf off that tree and considered my options. I could lose several days of my life to yet another failed attempt, or I could choose to turn that poison into love and life. I said a little prayer, radically accepted what happened, and let it go. Instead of ruminating for days, I experienced profound peace. I saved that leaf and still have it as a poignant reminder of my own power to choose whether I make things harder or easier for myself. As single adults, we are all single for one of the following 3 reasons. We're not yet married, we lost a spouse to death, or we lost a spouse through divorce. Sometimes we may experience both losses in this life. So we can get to know you a little bit better, and we can see the congregation. By raise of hands, how many of you are not yet married? Okay, a few. How many of you are widowed? Okay, a few more. And how many of you are divorced? Okay, a few more. All right, awesome. Thank you so much. We have a diversity of experience in this group. During the summer of 2020, we wrote all 20 chapters of Intentional Courtship in about 4 months. It wasn't in book form yet, but we wrote the entire manuscript in that time. It all came pouring out of us, and we felt really strongly that the church needed more supportive resources for mid-singles. It took us more than a year to get that manuscript perfected, polished, formatted, and eventually published in November of 2021. In the meantime, we started Love in Later Years, also known as Lily, to serve and minister to Latter-day Saint mid-singles and later married couples with blended families. In the midst of doing all of this, in April 2021 General Conference, we sat mesmerized. As Elder Gong stated, the majority of adult church members are now unmarried, widowed, or divorced. This is a significant change. It includes more than half our Relief Society sisters and more than half our adult priesthood brothers. And again, as President Ballard stated in the same conference, we heard, we long to help all who feel alone or feel they don't belong. Let me mention in particular those who are currently single. Brothers and sisters, more than half the adults in the church today are widowed, divorced, or not yet married. Isn't it interesting that in all the ways in which we may feel that we don't belong as single adults in a marriage and family-oriented church, that single adults are actually the great silent majority among us? In Lily, we personally define mid-singles. So if you hear us say mid-singles, you're all included, I promise, as any singles beyond the possibility of a first marriage in their 20s. Love and relationships tend to get more complex after that. Interestingly, our church provided its first ever face-to-face event for all single adults aged 31 plus 1 year ago this month, and on June 13th of 2021. Singles wards may be divided by ages for administrative purposes for those beyond the possibility of a first marriage in their 20s, yet the church chose to address all single adults aged 31 plus at once. It gave me some peace of mind knowing that we were on the right track with the same audience we are serving. The only difference is that in Lily, some might be ready for what we share, even if they're in their 20s, but they're already divorced or widowed. After working with mid-singles over the last 2 years in several capacity, we eagerly watched this historically significant face-to-face event, a huge effort to support and recognize mid-singles in our church, which we really were very excited about and really appreciated. There were so many things we loved about this, and if you didn't catch it, you can easily find it online. There was one thing in particular that concerned us, however. There were several singles interviews and each told their own story. At the beginning, we were told that each category of singlehood would be represented: divorce, widowhood, and not yet married single members. And yet somehow those who were divorced didn't actually say they were divorced. It seemed like a purposeful omission, and yet I don't think that it was intended that way. It was an inadvertent expression of a still shameful stigma that divorce carries in our religious culture. And it might have been the choice of the individuals involved. I mean, I know I would be nervous about telling my life story on nationally with all of my religious culture. But as I pondered it, I started realizing the ways in which I was still feeling shame inside of me many years after my divorce. And it was healing to recognize that I was still feeling that shame, and to let it go. I am who I am today because of all of my life experience, and that includes divorce twice. My hope is that all mid-singles will confidently own and express their experience and not feel shame. Don't be ashamed of the path you are on. Accept and embrace whatever it is as perfect for you. The first 8 chapters of intentional courtship are about healing from loss and finding peace. No book on dating for single adults who have likely loved and lost would be complete without it. If you don't feel ready to date, but would like to get ready, those 8 chapters are a great place to start.
All right. This is such a pleasure. But forget everything Cathy just said. We're going to show you how you will all find your eternal companion tonight by pairing you up and performing marriages. Kidding. Our discussion of the 3 Ps will demonstrate a progression from tragedy to tender mercy, which is the title of this fireside. During the most acute hardship of my life, a wise cousin that I have shared with me this statement by President Brigham Young. We talk about our trials and troubles here in this life, but suppose that you could see yourselves thousands and millions of years after you have proved faithful to your religion during the few short years of this time and have obtained eternal salvation and a crown of glory in the presence of God. Then look back on your lives here and see the losses, crosses, and disappointments, the sorrows. You would be constrained to exclaim, but what of all that? Those things were but a moment, and we are now here. As I coach and speak to Latter-day Saint mid-singles, I see a unique group of people who have experienced severe emotional pain, and most of us carry scars. Did you know scientists have actually done functional MRIs on people who've recently experienced an unwanted divorce and found that their brains light up in exactly the same areas as people who are experiencing acute physical pain? Now, this is not true for anger or depression or any other negative emotion, only for rejection. For myself, I remember a 4-year period during and after my marriage ended when I woke up every day feeling like I'd been kicked in the stomach. You probably relate to it, some of you. I carried that feeling around every day, all day long, and took it to bed every night. It was relentless. Well-meaning people around you who haven't experienced rejection on this level really don't understand the hell you are going through. We are all familiar with the example of soldiers returning from war with PTSD. Some of you have experienced traumas related to being beaten by a spouse or learning that your spouse had been unfaithful or experiencing other severe abuse. Some of you have not experienced major trauma, but have experienced what we call micro traumas. Perhaps every time you tried to kiss your spouse coming home from work or whatever, he or she turned his or her head to avoid your kiss. Now, if that happens once, maybe you chalk it up to protecting her makeup or something. But what if it's repeated over many years? Those tiny rejections and little abuses can add up to a very large trauma. Quick example, if you were rejected over the years, as I just described, and now you're in a new relationship, and let's suppose you try to kiss your partner and she turns her head, you've just been triggered and likely feel super rejected, even if it was a one-time thing to protect her makeup and has nothing to do with you. Now, get 2 people together who have both experienced rejection of some kind, and you have a perfect storm. When Cathy and I met, I had trauma surrounding rejection, and she had trauma surrounding being trapped in an unhealthy relationship. And together, we created a lot of drama. This is one reason the divorce rate is so high in second and third marriages. There is one reason, one experience described more extensively in intentional courtship, where I had traveled an hour to where Cathy lived to attend a baptism of my niece on Saturday. I arrived in town Friday evening, and Cathy and I had plans to have breakfast the next morning, but Cathy asked me to come over. I met her kids for the first time that night. It was awesome. We spent 5 hours together. I helped put those kids to bed, and we stayed up talking until after midnight. As I was leaving for my brother's home that evening, Cathy said, we'd better cancel our breakfast date. She didn't want to go to bed late and get up early on a weekend when she had the kids. Totally reasonable, right? But I was completely triggered and feeling rejected. I spent most of the drive over to my brother's house planning how to break up with Cathy. No kidding. Maybe 3/4 of the way there, I came to my senses. I thought, hey, wait a minute. We just spent 5 hours together, for heaven's sakes. I just met her kids for the first time. This is not rejection. It's a big step forward. Now, why was my initial interpretation of Cathy's decision so wildly incorrect? In psychology, they call this a cognitive distortion. My perception was distorted because I was reacting to traumatic events in the past rather than seeing clearly what was right in front of me. Put two people together who are both carrying trauma and get ready to watch the circus. So, how can I find peace when I'm filled with fear and trauma? I love the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace, but it actually means more than that. It means wholeness. It means restoration. So when you are in shalom, you have peace in your mind and in your heart. I suggest you begin paying close attention to whether you are in a condition of shalom throughout your day. Learn to recognize the difference between being in shalom and being disrupted. Do you feel good inside or a little off? Do you feel a calm confidence or fear? If you are not in shalom, don't make important decisions, particularly relationship decisions. Don't make that kind of decision in the middle of an argument with your partner. I will get into a lot more specific suggestions in part 2 of this fireside, but for now, I just want to focus on the most important step. Have you ever heard and felt intimidated by the commandment to be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect? Interestingly, the word translated perfect also means complete or whole. It's similar to the word shalom. So I offer you the verses leading up to this commandment for perfection. Ye have heard it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? If any of you has been divorced, betrayed, or hurt, you know what the Lord is asking and how difficult this can be. Forgiveness and love to those who curse you, hate you, despitefully use you, or persecute you is really the hardest thing we do on the pathway to perfection. But the destination is a peaceful wholeness that Paul described as the peace of God, which passeth all understanding. You cannot really be prepared for a new relationship when you are still fighting the battles of an old one within yourself. The prophet Joseph taught us that Christ-like love is the bond of perfectness and peace. Several years ago, my former wife and I met with our son's counselor, and I perceived that my former wife was being manipulative with the counselor. And I could feel this inner rage starting to rise within me. I was severely disrupted and reacted negatively to everything my former wife said. Later, I had the chance to meet with the counselor alone, and I said, you know, I think sometimes I've forgiven her, but then she does something that feels dishonest or manipulative, and I feel myself picking up that rock again. Well, the counselor replied, it's good that you can notice when you're picking up the rock, because then you can calmly and intentionally just put it back down. I have thought since that meeting that this is what Jesus meant when he asked us to forgive until 70 times 7. Forgiveness means letting go, like letting go of a helium balloon or a bowling ball. Letting go is easy, right? You just release your grip and the object floats or falls away. So why do we hold on so tightly to anger and pain when that is hurting us and keeping us stuck? We do it because we think it creates some kind of meaning for our pain. It gives us the satisfaction of being in the right. Our brain's survival mechanism wants to be right more than it wants to be happy. So the natural man wants to hold on to anger and pain and try to derive some kind of satisfaction from that. But the only peace and happiness to be found is really in letting go and thereby making room for happier emotions, a new love, and a stronger self.
All right, now we're moving into progress, our second focus this evening. Sometimes after significant relationship loss, we can feel like we're stuck in the mud and that life is moving super slow. Once we've found peace and have faced some of our fears and transformed them into peace, we can venture into the realm of creating our new reality. You've probably heard of the new normal. Whatever your new normal is, this is where you get to decide more actively what you want your new normal to be in the long run. Do you want to develop your career more? Do you want to be the best single parent ever? Do you want love and marriage? Do you want all of that and more? Start dreaming. I think dreaming is highly underrated. When the heavens and the earth were created for us, they were first envisioned and talked about. There was a plan for that creation. Anything worthwhile in life requires us to do the same. Dreaming and imagining can bring about miraculous results. We can create our lives on purpose with a little creativity and faith. This morning I woke up with this thought from Alice in Wonderland. Alice laughed. "There is no use in trying," she said. "One cannot believe in possible things." "I dare say you haven't practiced much," said the Queen. "When I was younger, I did it for a half hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." There are impossible things I personally am trying to believe right now. They really only feel impossible because of the limitations I've put on them in my human brain. My mind tries to tell me what is possible based on past experience. Can you relate with that? Do we really want our limited past to define our entire future? If not, dreaming, imagining, and building faith in good things to come is a far better option. A few months ago, when we were interviewing Dr. Greg Bear, author of the Real Love series, we asked him what he thinks is the most important thing to prepare for real love in marriage, and he said 3 words: be more healed. He also suggested that you'll know when you're ready to date when you don't need a relationship to be happy. This has become something we call the dating paradox, which we featured in a video on our YouTube channel. The ironic thing is that most people are ready to date as soon as they don't need to. Creating a new life full of peace, contentment, and happiness is the best way to get ready for dating. It doesn't have to be perfect, just in progress. Have you ever heard the saying that love heals all wounds? I disagree. No, I quoted that wrong. I'm sorry. Have you ever heard the saying that time heals all wounds? That's what I disagree with. While time is a factor in our healing process, I mean, you wouldn't typically expect a physical wound to heal like instantly. We also can, emotionally, we can become bitter and deeply scarred by the thoughts and the stories that keep us stuck in grief and pain indefinitely. All the time and even the best intentions in the world won't do much without a little work and effort to go with it. I just want to share something kind of off script for a second. When I had something really it was like the worst thing that could possibly happen to me, or at least I thought so. In fact, I think I kind of created it with my own fear, but that's another story. I remember thinking, this isn't fair. I shouldn't have to heal from this. Like, that's their problem. They did that. Like, and oh man, I've been humbled through the school of life since then. And I realize now that no matter who did what, healing is always my job. If I'm hurt, if I'm injured, doesn't matter whose fault it is, does not matter. So even if it seems unfair, intentional personal development is what will support our healing. And this will include shifting our thought patterns to elevate our energy, emotions, to improve the behaviors and outcomes of our lives, kind of like we talked about before with the FSIBO model. I believe that the combination of time plus intentional effort and applying the atonement in our lives will go a lot further than simply letting time do whatever it does on its own. Our bodies require medical attention to heal properly. Our emotional and spiritual well-being does too. We encourage you to process grief and loss with wisdom by allowing clean pain to be felt and released. We also encourage you to prevent dirty pain by shifting your stories that you might have adopted along the way that don't serve your healing process. Now let's talk about the difference between clean and dirty pain, because maybe you're not familiar with those terms, but here's the best way I knew how to explain it. Have you ever done something wrong and felt truly remorseful? That is godly sorrow, and it is part of the repentance process. That is clean pain. It is painful, but ultimately healing and cleansing. Now, have you ever gone beyond that feeling and added shameful thoughts? I think we probably all have, and maybe we all still do to some extent, but that's dirty pain, and it can go on for years, decades, maybe even the rest of your life. I once received a blessing for something I was feeling a lot of pain over, and God told me in the blessing that I had suffered enough. I was shocked. I'd been suffering for about a month. I thought it should be years, but it was like so much sooner than I would have expected. And unfortunately, I went on to suffer for years after that. And I couldn't figure out why or how to get rid of it. He told me I'd suffered enough, and I knew it. I knew that was right, but I couldn't figure it out. But it took me a while to understand that I was stuck in dirty pain, and God was trying to lift me out of it and help me to see it for what it was. The adversary has been lying to us since the beginning of this world. And, in what is that book? The parable, like the parasite?
Oh, The Voice of Knowledge.
Okay, in The Voice of Knowledge by Don Miguel Ruiz, he talks about the parasite and how the parasite comes into our minds and tells us lies. And it's really our job to question every thought we have, because we once it's in our head, we think it's ours. And there's a lot of thoughts that are not only not ours, but they're lies. And this same thing can happen when relationships end. We may vacillate between thoughts and feelings of shame. These feelings of shame that I had for years and years after God had said I'd suffered enough. We can feel those feelings of shame for our part in a failed relationship, and then, have it kind of swing to blame for our former partner's fault part. And sometimes if we're like black and white thinkers, we think, oh, it has to be one or the other. Someone has to be to blame. It's either me or him, or, me or her. But both feel awful and are entirely unuseful. It all leads to dirty pain that keeps us stuck in a vicious cycle of useless judgment until we choose to break free from it. Ask yourself, what do I need to break free from? On a lighter note, I want to end my portion of these thoughts on progress with a little advice for women here who would like to date and find a forever companion, but you aren't sure where to start. Perhaps you are waiting for Mr. Right to come along and make your first move. I know when I was single, I prayed that God would just bring him to my door. I didn't want to do the work. I was willing and I did the work, but I didn't want to do it. Please know that you don't have to settle only for the men who are interested in you and brave enough to take the first step. You can intentionally create your dating life. I did. And since then, I've learned about the modern day version of an old-fashioned notion called dropping the handkerchief. In the olden days, in the presence of a handsome gentleman, women would drop their handkerchiefs in hopes that he might pick it up and strike up a conversation. We don't carry around handkerchiefs anymore, however. There are modern day versions of this same idea. Anytime you can provide an opening for a man, it makes it easier for him to do what we are all scared to do in mid-single datings: take risks. All love requires risk. I hate to say it. I know we'd prefer to find a way without it, but all love requires risk, and we can support and encourage each other to take meaningful and wise risks with those who we come to know are worthy of that risk.
President Franklin Roosevelt famously said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Fear itself is what holds us back from healing, dating, and creating new relationships after a relationship loss. Why do we fear? The short answer is that your brain is 2 million years old and it's wired for survival and not necessarily for happiness and joy. We have a fight or flight mechanism that warns of danger, but it's way over inclusive in trying to help keep us safe. It warns us of a lot of red flags that aren't really dangerous. If you go through trauma and pain, that survival instinct pulls on you even harder not to take risks. And you aren't going to find love without risk, as Cathy just said. Risk is the price of admission. And I've seen mid-singles turning backward somersaults, trying to discover a way to find love without risk, a more sneaky way, coming in the back door. It doesn't work. Smarter people than you and me have wasted their lives trying to figure out how to find love without risk. And as far as I know, no one has succeeded. So how can we overcome this fear and step into our futures? First, see a trauma response for what it is and understand that not all of your thoughts and reactions are accurate. Like the story I related in my first segment. From there, you can begin to kind of self-confront and evaluate whether something you are seeing is actually troubling or if you're making a mountain out of a molehill by calling it a red flag because it triggers trauma from your past. Ask yourself if the thing you are seeing is troubling all by itself, or if you're just seeing it as a sign that something worse might happen someday. Second, pay attention and learn to recognize when you're emotionally flooded, meaning that you are in fight or flight, and then have a plan for moving through the episode. Are you feeling panicked? Are your thoughts racing? Do you feel the need to act right now, even though there's no real immediacy to the situation? You may need to take a personal time out and withdraw from a situation. I've also found exercise to be really helpful. Sometimes when I'm at work, there are literally moments when I drop to the floor and do 20 push-ups just to help relieve my anxiety. Guided meditation can also be helpful, and don't discount the comfort that can come from personal prayer, finding a quiet place and pouring out your heart to God. Interesting statistic. John and Julie Gottman did a study where they measured the vital signs of couples discussing problems in their relationships. You know what they found? Anytime one person's heart rate reaches 100 beats per minute, there is a 0% chance that they will resolve the issue. So what is the point of battling on and on after one or both people are flooded? Cathy and I have a procedure in our relationship where either person can call a timeout at any moment. Once timeout is invoked, it's absolute. The conversation stops immediately. When both people are calm, usually from 20 minutes to a few hours, we come back together. We spend the time away self-soothing, regaining our shalom, not preparing a rebuttal. When we come back together, we begin by holding hands and saying a prayer. Now, when we follow this process, we can generally resolve our problem in 5 minutes. Don't we tell our kids all the time, decide in advance what you're going to do if you're offered drugs so you won't have to make that decision in the heat of the moment under peer pressure? We need to be similarly intentional when it comes to managing conflicts with loved ones. We don't make good decisions when we're in fight or flight. We have to know the answer before. Now, Cathy and I have it in us to fight all night long and say hurtful things, but we don't. We know better. So remember that managing your emotions, as Cathy said, is your responsibility, not your partner's. Now is a great time to practice making and keeping agreements for managing conflict while you're dating, particularly as a relationship gets more serious. Statistics on second and third marriages are not great. You've probably seen them. Somewhere between 65 and 75% of them end in divorce. How then do we beat these odds? By being very intentional in how we create and manage our relationships together. Intentional courtship leads to intentional marriage, and thus the title of our book. If we manage our relationships with emotion rather than intention, it's going to be a hot mess. So again, the second suggestion is to learn to recognize when you are flooded and plan in advance to deal with it constructively. Third, a lot of trauma release happens in conversations where you really feel understood. The only way to achieve that is to engage with people you can be totally honest with. You can never feel truly accepted while you're wearing a mask because you know deep down that people are just accepting the mask and not the real person. At first, this can be really intimidating, but find a circle of good friends and be real with them. I tell you, when I was going through my divorce, I reached out to old mission companions, friends from high school, and various times in my life who I might have been out of touch with for years. And they were virtually all caring and supportive. And a few of them were really, really wise. Fourth, practice radical acceptance. Cathy touched on this. Radical acceptance is simply when you accept what is and stop fighting reality or stop struggling to interpret it. It happens when you stop trying to make it okay and just accept the reality of where you are as an objective fact. Now, this is particularly difficult for us as single Latter-day Saints because we all grew up on President McKay's admonition that no other success can compensate for failure in the home. So when a marriage fails, we think oftentimes that we've failed at life. I see tremendous pain and disappointment everywhere I look in the mid-singles community. When you experience a loss, there is going to be pain, but that pain doesn't have to progress to suffering and it doesn't need to last forever. The suffering is intensified and prolonged if we are fighting the reality of it, or as Cathy talked about with dirty pain, if we're hanging our judgments on it. Fifth, choose new thoughts. Cathy talked about how we hang heavy thoughts on our reality, like this wasn't God's plan for me, or it wasn't supposed to turn out like this. And we might hang those thoughts on a divorce, the death of a loved one, or persistent loneliness, and doubt that can come from being single for a long time. There's a scriptural story I just love about this principle. In Alma 8, you may remember Alma's feelings after he's rejected by the people of Ammonihah, and we're told that Satan had gotten great hold upon the hearts of the people of the city. And Alma, quote, labored much in spirit, wrestling with God in mighty prayer, as many of you have done over relationships that were troubled or slipping away. The scripture tells us that the people reviled him and spit upon him and caused that he should be cast out of their city. And as many of you have been cast out of relationships. Now, notice the heaviness of the words describing Alma's emotions as he left the city. The scripture describes him as weighed down with sorrow, wading through much tribulation and anguish of soul because of the wickedness of the people who were in the city of Ammonihah. So Alma's seriously bummed out. I think it's safe to say that he was clinically depressed when a good counselor appears in the form of an angel from the presence of God who gives him some really good advice. the angel said, "Blessed art thou, Alma, therefore lift up thy head." I've heard Tony Robbins talk about how if you square your shoulders and look ahead and not look down and be slumped, that you will actually feel better, feel more empowered, feel less depressed and down. And it's true. And the angel understood that principle and taught it to Alma. But he said, "Lift up thy head and rejoice, for thou hast great cause to rejoice. For thou hast been faithful in keeping the commandments of God from the time which thou receivest thy first message from him. Behold, I am he that delivered it unto you." Now, notice how Alma's heavy emotions came up when he was focused on the people of the city, who he had no control over. Who did the angel tell him to focus on? Himself. He also reassures Alma that he is the same angel who delivered Alma's first message. Could this angel have been assigned as a guardian angel to Alma? I think the implication is there. Does it give you any hope that heavenly beings may be aware of you and helping to guide you in your journey? So the angel tells Alma to return to the city, the same one he had been cast out of. How did Alma respond to this message? Did he slump his shoulders and complain? No. The scripture says he returned speedily to the city, not reluctantly, but speedily. And did he find a more receptive audience this time? Nope. What he found was Amulek, the man who would become his longtime mission companion, and he would experience miraculous and momentous events with him. If Alma had not changed his focus and changed his thoughts internally, do you think he would have returned to the hostile environment of Ammonihah and found his companion? What could change your thoughts to motivate you to return to the sometimes hostile world of dating and possibly find your eternal companion? Ponder it.
So far we haven't followed the book very closely, even though our subtitle is Peace, Progress, and Pairing Up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Our messages have been pretty much whatever we felt like we needed to share with you tonight. But it's just impossible to share in an hour what lays in 318 pages with more than 190 references, even more if you include all the scriptures embedded in the text. But we'd always like to just impart everything we know all at once. we pared it down to about an hour's worth of information we thought would be most helpful. But for this third part, this third focus on pairing up, I'd like to share a few small parts from one of my favorite chapters, which is chapter 18, titled The List of Qualities You're Looking for. We all have had a list at some point in our lives. I think most of us have. Actually, maybe by raise of hands, how many of you have had a list? Okay, some of you at least. So how long is your list? Just to ask this of yourself. I don't know about each of you, but my personal list got longer after having loved and lost to prevent negative experiences I didn't want to have again. Over time, however, I started to realize that was totally unrealistic and not all that helpful. So as I was a few years into my intentional dating years after my second marriage ended, I narrowed it down. And we encourage all single adults who are dating to get crystal clear on the 3 to 5 most important things you want in a companion, and let the rest of your desires become negotiable. Now, I would say, if for those of you that raised your hand and you have a list, make sure it's the most important things. For those of you who didn't raise your hand, you've never even considered this, I highly recommend that you do. It's one of the most important parts of intentional courtship. Well, no, I don't know. There's just so many important parts, but this is a big one. All right. So for me, my non-negotiable requirements for marriage were 4 things. I wanted a partner who could create these things with me: a house of order, environment, finances, and communication, a house of God with a sure spiritual foundation with deep roots, prayerful, humble, honest person of integrity, Sabbath day observer, and temple attending. A house of love, healthy, attractive, taller than me, preferably, that we have chemistry and compatibility, supportive, honors timeouts as needed. That was a big one for me. And desired to work things out, unconditional respect and kindness connected, and a house of family. I wanted my companion to want more children, to raise our children together, his, mine, ours, nurture extended relationships. I wasn't actually planning to read all that, but I think the subtext is important. But house of order, God, love, and family. Those are the 4 houses I wanted to create. It's what I wrote verbatim on a special blue Post-it note in my planner. I did this so I could carry it forward every year for as long as it took me to find this guy. This shorter, more focused list helped me gain clarity about what was most important for me from the long list of preferences that I had started with. It all came down to finding a partner who could create these with me, someone heading in the same direction. Now, I'm going to share Jeff's. He also had 4 items. And right before he shares his 4, he says, in the end, you don't love a list. You will love a real person with his or her own personality, strengths, and weaknesses. The person you will love is a unique child of God, every bit as valuable to him as you are. I only had 4 items on my list. Someone who knows how to be happy, someone who can have adult conversation about a difficult subject without exploding or stonewalling. I think that kind of goes back to our timeouts pretty well. No serious sexual hangups or fears. Someone I can marry in the temple and build an eternal marriage with, which I think correlates with my house of God. That's it. I could be pretty much flexible with everything else. Now, to summarize this chapter, I just want to kind of show you, we also ended up with a long list of those dots right there that you saw. I don't know if you can see it. Anyway, those are all of the bonus qualities Jeff found in me. And then elsewhere in the chapter is a long list of bonus qualities I found in Jeff. And you know, what's really cool about having a short list is that you'll end up with so many bonus qualities to really love and appreciate, and it will be fun surprises. Both of our lists were limited to create the kind of relationship and life we wanted with a partner. We enjoy seeing that creation come to life in our marriage now. Let's see. So that's what I wanted to share about the list. I also, I just wanted to end that portion of this part of a pairing up with you, that even though, we ultimately chose each other, and that list can make a really big difference in your dating experience and the decisions that you'll be making. It doesn't mean that you'll know immediately when you've met someone with those qualities. We actually had to figure it out over time. In fact, Jeff's financial situation that he shared on our first date, I remember thinking, oh no, this is never going to work. The first thing on my list is a house of order, and that includes finances. But I'll admit, over time, he was showing me that that's something he wanted. And when we got married, it was a bit of an act of faith on my part that we would be able to create that together. And we are actually. So when you consider your list, just remember you're not looking for, or that you are looking for attributes and direction in life to be compatible, not necessarily the current situation to be ideal. Sometimes that won't always be there yet, but we don't marry a situation or a list. We marry a real person with real attributes, and that's what we're really looking for. All right, so to move on, I would like to kind of wrap up my part of pairing up with another concept that I think is really important to explore with dating partners, and that is priority order. I'll touch on highlights of the first few podcast episodes we did on LilyPod, episodes 2 through 6, if you want to listen to them and dive deeper. They begin with God is love, so are we. And they move into relationship priority, followed by 3 separate podcasts on cultivating love for God, self, and neighbor. So here are the highlights. I used to ask every dating partner what priority they would place between themselves, a potential spouse, their children, and God. Have you ever thought about, how many of you have thought of this before? Like about yourself, and have any of you ever asked like a dating partner that question? I don't know if I see any hands. Okay, well, maybe you'll all start asking. I actually got a variety of answers when I was dating. And gratefully, Jeff's was the exact same as mine. I asked him, he told me it was the exact same, which was God, self, spouse, and children. And I'll tell you, I based my priority order on my own understanding of the gospel at the time, but ultimately I've refined it since then to be based on the 2 great commandments, which is to love, thou shalt love thy Lord, thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. God clearly comes first in these commandments. Self comes next because I believe that in the phrase, love thy neighbor as thyself is not an afterthought. It means you actually love yourself first. It isn't vain, conceited, or selfish, but it is in taking responsibility and being accountable for the nurturing of your own self-development, self-love, and self-compassion. The more I love and support myself in filling and maintaining my own emotional bucket. Have you guys ever all heard of emotional buckets? Raise of hands, emotional buckets. Okay, I see quite a few hands. It's the more I maintain the level of an emotional bucket that is full, the more I end up having plenty to give as it spills out. I just barely learned this from a coaching client of mine who learned it from someone else. And I'm just so grateful because this is like a new concept for me, brand new. We tend to think we give to others from an emotional bucket as long as we have some water in there. Just as long as we have a little water in there and it's not empty, then we can give. But it's actually wiser to give from the overflow, because when we stay full and it's overflowing, it means we have plenty to keep and we have plenty to give, and we won't emotionally deplete ourselves. I mean, if you think about it, so Jeff and I were driving actually to a Lily wedding, so somebody who purchased intentional courtship, did some coaching with us and got married. They invited us to their wedding and it was awesome. And we were driving there, and then we were driving back, and we were just enjoying the beautiful day, and we didn't pay attention, and we were almost out of gas in the middle of nowhere. I think it was Wyoming or something. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we weren't even in our home state. We're from Utah. Anyway, we were really worried about running out of gas, because that can be really, really bad on your car. And I will tell you, my personal body, right around the time Jeff and I got married, from being like the super single mom that did everything and running on adrenaline all the time, my body completely depleted. And so that was me giving from a well that was like on the verge of, and like being empty, just like we were driving on a car that was on the verge of empty. It's just not smart. It's really not, it's really not wise. So just start to think about your emotional bucket and having it full for you so that you can give more freely and without that scarcity, that lack in your energy. Okay, back to the script. So obviously it's wiser to give from the overflow, as we've talked about. No one else can be responsible for our own emotional, physical, or spiritual well-being. And, when we can do that. And when we've done that, we have so much to give our neighbors. Here's a little hint. Marriage is much easier when we don't place our emotional well-beings on our partner. They can never really do that for us, and it places a huge amount of pressure and tension on the relationship. And as Jeff has said in his portions of this talk, that we really have to be responsible for ourselves in our own emotional well-being. So now that we have God and self covered, then we move on to loving our neighbors, because that's really that's the third thing. But like, how do we define, what neighbor comes first? Now, of course, sometimes it's going to depend on the situation, but in general, I think it comes with our closest neighbors taking priority from the inside out. So if I'm married, it's literally my spouse I sleep with. We all deserve that special someone in the world that cares about us more than anyone else. Who else can better do this than a marital companion? Eventually, children leave and have families of their own. If everything goes well, our spouse is the one and only who remains with us. So it is important to nurture that relationship. Now, you don't have that relationship right now, but you still want to know if that's something you're willing to do, and be able to express that in your dating. After our spouse, our close, and our children, our next closest neighbors after our spouse would be our children and anyone else who lives with us. And as far as proximity goes, our most influences on those closest to us. So now, some single parents have understandably expressed concern that if they place a future spouse they don't know yet as their priority, that could potentially lead to their children being abused. The way I see it, the way Jeff and I see it, is that if you put God first and your partner puts God first, and we really know him and understand that he wants all his beloved children to be treated well, neither of us would ever tolerate abuse in this home. God is love, and if we love him and carry his love in us, then we're prepared to love our spouse as our greatest priority and love our combined children together as a team. Now, once we love everyone at home well, we expand outside the home to extended family, literal neighbors, ward members. Anyone we feel called to have influence with is our next stewardship. For us, it's you. Mid-singles and later married couples are a big priority for us. Right after our relationship with God, each other, and our kids and extended family. I know we haven't met you personally, but we love you. We have been serving you for more than 2 years and creating a lot of resources for you because we really care. We've been where you are, and I hope you can feel that.
All right. I hope we're going to have some time for Q&A, but I really feel strongly about you hearing the rest of this. It was a bitterly cold New Year's Eve as I lay on the floor of the Truckers Lounge at the Flying J in Snowville, Utah, with my 2 sons, feeling the deepest shame and despair of my life. We were stranded with car trouble in the middle of a 4-day holiday weekend. In a 2-year period, a couple of years earlier, I had lost an election, my business, my dream home overlooking Puget Sound, and my wife of 15 years divorced me. I saw the most meaningful dreams and hard-won achievements of my life lost one by one. I lost everything. Less than a year before I was stranded in Snowville, I gave up my partnership in a law firm because I was failing to find clients and couldn't afford the overhead. But I got hired by a startup company for a meager salary. 2 months prior to being stranded, the company ran out of money and could no longer pay me. I went back to what I knew. I started a law firm with no money and a big deficit of life energy at that time. After all those major losses, I was now stranded with my kids in the middle of nowhere in the dead of winter with a few $100 in my checking account. I knew I didn't have enough to afford the repairs, let alone having enough to stay in a motel for 2 days or rent a car. I had no credit card because my credit rating was shot after 5 years of severe financial failure. I lay there the whole night trying to think of a way out of this predicament without having to ask anyone for help. You know how us guys are. The 2 dominant thoughts that were playing on repeat in my brain were, my kids deserve so much better than this, and I have a doctorate degree and a postdoc. How in the devil did I end up here? I remember thinking, did I really go through 8 years of college for this? That New Year's Eve was in so many ways the lowest moment of my life. I felt weak, exposed, and like a total failure. And it was the beginning of the blessed life I have today. Now, quarterback Kurt Warner discussed a similar experience in his Hall of Fame induction speech. He was living in poverty on food stamps and stocking shelves in a grocery store at night when the power got turned off in his house because he didn't pay the bill. He ran out of gas in the freezing cold of an Iowa winter with his wife and children in the car. And he said this in his induction speech: "The four of us began rummaging through the seats, hoping to scrape up enough change to get home. We didn't find many coins, and as I jogged back to the gas station, 3 miles, I kept thinking, my kids deserve so much better than this. I convinced the attendant to give me some gas, while at the same time convincing myself this would never happen again." Now, when I saw that scene portrayed in the film American Underdog, I've got to tell you, I got teary. Tears welled up in my eyes because it felt so much like my own experience. In its own way, my story is just as miraculous as Kurt's. Today, I'm married to the woman of my dreams. I have a career where I earn a 6-figure income advising the governor and the attorney general on important constitutional law issues. I have 2 stepsons that I adore in addition to my 2 sons, who I also adore. My wife and I have an organization allowing us to minister to tens of thousands of middle-aged single men and women who suffer similar challenges to those I've experienced. And when people ask me, "How are you?" I always say, "I have a very blessed life." The Bible is full of stories about people who experienced tragedies, found themselves in impossible situations, and were miraculously delivered. Consider, for example, the story of Joseph sold into Egypt by his brothers who faked his death. Like Joseph, I felt sold into Egypt by someone I loved. I felt deeply betrayed. Imagine the deep, hollow ache that Joseph must have felt as he was sold into slavery in a strange land where he knew no one. Probably didn't even speak the language at first. He must have felt just utterly alone. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to the captain of the guard in Pharaoh's court, and even as a slave, he prospered. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph was made overseer of all his master's house. One might think Joseph had been through enough. However, accused of a crime he didn't commit, Joseph sunk even lower than a slave as he was cast into prison. But the keeper of the prison also observed that the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made to prosper. So he put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. Both as a slave and as a prisoner, he prospered where he was. Ultimately, Pharaoh became aware of Joseph's spiritual gifts and proclaimed, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is?" At age 30, Joseph became prime minister of the world's greatest empire. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, "See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot. I call it Air Force 2. And they cried before him, "Bow the knee." And he made him a ruler over all the land of Egypt. In a single day, Joseph is raised from prison to power in the most powerful nation on earth. I think it is the most improbable rise to power in the history of the world. With his newly bestowed power, of course, he does great things. He uses his spiritual gifts to foresee a famine. He creates a grain storage program and saves a nation, and ultimately his own family, from starvation. As he forgave his jealous brothers for selling him into slavery, Joseph recognized the subtle but powerful hand of God in his improbable journey. He says, "Now therefore be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Our Father in heaven used tragedy and even the evil choices of others to serve his purposes. Joseph's story is a testimony of Paul's promise that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. God has the power to take all the adversity that comes to you and turn it into something miraculous. We might consider President Reagan like a modern Joseph. In his final interview with Tom Brokaw right before he left the White House, he talked about deep disappointment as a young man when he didn't get a job that he wanted as a manager in the sporting goods department at Montgomery Ward. But pretty soon thereafter, he got a job as a sports announcer in a small market, which led him to a career in entertainment, which led to his career in politics, which led to his becoming president of the United States, which changed the world. He made the point that if he had gotten the job at Montgomery Ward, he might still be working there instead of president of the United States. President Reagan made the point that an event that was supposedly bad led to something better than he could have hoped. Later in the interview, the president commented about the first girl he loved and how he had been engaged to her, but circumstances took them to different places and she ended up marrying someone else and broke his heart. President Reagan made the point that he would not have had his wonderful storybook marriage to Nancy if that earlier relationship had not failed. And again, made the point that something bad led to him meeting the love of his life. If we go back to Kurt Warner, many of you know his story. Kind of like Pharaoh's words about Joseph, Coach Dick Vermeil said to Kurt, "The reason you made this team is I feel there is something special about you, something different. And I couldn't let you go without seeing if it was true." Kurt got one last chance to become an NFL quarterback at age 27. He played his first NFL game at age 28 when starting quarterback Trent Green went down with an injury. As some of you know, Kurt led his team all the way to the Super Bowl and won it. He was named the league MVP and the Super Bowl MVP. Kurt had gone from living on food stamps to being in a position to negotiate a contract for millions of dollars. Over an 11-year career, Kurt started in 3 Super Bowls for 2 different teams and was ultimately inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame. He talked about his dreams as a young boy of being like Dan Marino or John Elway, being drafted in the early rounds and going to a team with a big contract and having a lot of fanfare. His observation about the way things turned out, however, was God wasn't just giving me a career. He was giving me a story. He was giving me a miracle. Now, as my story continued, after 4 years of poverty and depression, I decided to go to Texas and take advantage of the oil boom. God bless Texas. I did title research for oil companies. Now, I didn't love it, but I made a decent living and felt like I could finally exhale after years of anxiety and stress. I worked my way into a corporate job and moved to Houston, where I remarried. 5 months later, my car died, oil prices plummeted, and I was laid off. For reasons I won't go into publicly, I felt it was necessary to leave my wife, and we were soon divorced. Were these tragedies? Boy, it sure felt like it at the time. The night my 17-year-old son, Henry, and I left my second wife, I kind of broke down in the car and I said, "Henry, sometimes I just feel like giving up." Henry replied, "Dad, you're the most positive person I know. You can't give up." Somehow, some way, my teenage son miraculously knew exactly what I needed to hear at that critical moment. Were these events actually tragic? If I had not gotten divorced for the second time, I wouldn't have Cathy. I wouldn't have my 2 stepsons. If I had not been laid off from my corporate job in Houston, I would probably still be running oil and gas titles in East Texas instead of representing the governor on important constitutional law issues, which is a big passion for me. All the difficulties I've described tonight felt like tragedies at the time. But I understand now that they were tender mercies. Every loss I experienced was to make space for something better. Like the children of Israel, my faith deepened by coming to know God in the wilderness, for that is where we meet him. I want to leave you with something profound that I have learned through this experience. Our feelings of weakness and helplessness and desperation come from forgetting who we are in relationship to God. I quote President John Taylor. Do you feel as though some dreadful calamity has happened to you? Have you forgot who you are and what your object is? Have you forgot that you profess to be saints of the Most High God, clothed upon with the holy priesthood? Have you forgot that you are aiming to become kings and priests unto the Lord and queens and priestesses to him? Notwithstanding any dreadful calamity in your life, friends, you have been or may be anointed with all the royal power you need to take the broken pieces of your life and build something glorious, beautiful, and eternal. As I contemplated my own dating journey the last time, I remember thinking that I had been anointed to become a king when I was 19 years old. And I was not just looking for a companion, I was looking for my queen. And that changed the way I looked and the way I thought about it. In conclusion, I want to quote a short passage from Intentional Courtship that sums up my hope and prayer for you tonight. On May 11th, 2018, I knelt at the altar in the Provo City Center Temple, itself a symbol of beauty and power rising like a phoenix from the ashes of destruction, and looked into the eyes of my stunning bride. Surrounded by loved ones on both sides of the veil, and started my life over again at age 50. I was overwhelmed by the abundant gifts that had been restored to me by a loving Father in heaven. And in that moment, I shed tears of gratitude for the exceptional woman kneeling with me at that altar, for her belief in me, her love, and the sacred promises we were making to each other. In that moment, I was grateful beyond words that neither of us had given up on the dream and taken the easier path. I thought again about the biblical story of Job, because the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Don't give up on love. Don't give up on yourselves. Be the kings and queens you were always destined to become. I pray the Lord gives each of you twice as much as you had before. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.